been involved in a couple of discussions here on YouTube recently, partly about life, you know, whether it's worth living, what is a good life, that kind of thing. And then another, in some ways related set of conversations about consciousness and things to do with sensation, awareness, sensory engagement, those kinds of things. And in both cases, the conversation either stall out or raise frustrations because of a difficulty in terminology and the difficulty in defining the key terms that you seem to be working with, which is, as I say, consciousness and life. And I get a strong feeling that there's no way of resolving it, quite frankly. I think different terms have to be brought in, and I would want to do that. And I think it's to do with categories, actually. I think it's to do with those terms and how those terms work categorially, because there are different kinds of categories. So I'll just see if I can explain what I mean by that. I mean, in a way, consciousness, for example. How could I get to this? Yeah, it's very hard to start off, well, to think of a set of necessary and sufficient conditions, a good definition for consciousness. What is easy to get, and what everybody seems to have, and nobody seems to doubt the existence of, is experience of consciousness. Experience it in ourselves, the observation of it in others, or the assumed observation of it in others, and so on. Everybody knows that consciousness exists, so we have it as a concept. And we have a category. We have a category of all those things that are conscious. You know, I'm in that category. Every human being who's alive and awake is in that category. A lot of animals are in that category, some aren't, a lot of them aren't. For me, plants aren't in there, but clearly for some other people they are. Bacteria are nowhere near it for me. Some of the people they are. You know, rocks and sand and water, empty space, absolutely not in it for me. But again, for a few people they are. So everybody understands the category of consciousness. We might do different things. So I should have tape over my mic, but I didn't think it was going to be windy anyway. So we all understand the category of consciousness. We might just have different things in it. But this is where it comes on to what kind of a category is it? And there's two types of categories in, I guess, philosophy of language or something. There are what are called classical categories, and then there are radial categories. Classical categories are defined by necessary and sufficient conditions. So you have a definition, and if the object under scrutiny fits that definition, it's in the category. If it doesn't fit the definition, it's out of the category. So the best one there is numbers, even numbers, let's say. There's a category of even numbers. If you've got a particular number, it's divisible by 2, it's in the category. It's not divisible by 2, it's out of the category. There's no blurry edges, there's no fuzziness about it. It's in, out, thank you and goodbye. Really, that's it. Classical categories. And then there's radial categories. And radial categories are different. Radial categories are marked not by necessarily sufficient conditions, drawing a boundary around the outside of whatever's in it. Radial categories are formed by prototypical members of that category and then family resemblances. Prototypical members and then family resemblances. So, for example, some of the examples that George Lakoff gives and Eleanor Roche and a bunch of other people give is something like mother. Now, mother sounds like it might be a classical category. You know, a female who has a child. But then we've got stepmothers, don't we? And we have adoptive mothers. And we have mothers-in-law. And then we have birth mothers. And then we have surrogate mothers. And then we have all these kind of qualifications. Which means it's not quite as solid a category as classical a category as we think. It's actually much more like a prototypical category. We all know what a mother is, we've all got that image in our head, and we've probably got a typical or a prototypical example of that in our head, probably someone like our own mothers. And then we've got slight variance on that, and the more variance there is, the further away from the centre of that category it gets, until you do approach a kind of fuzzy boundary. If your father marries someone that you went to school with, you know, someone who's the same age as you, could easily happen, couldn't it? Does that person become your mother? Well, kind of, but it's very fuzzy, isn't it? It's a long way away out on one of those radial spokes sticking out from the central prototypical examples. And most of our experiences are like that. Most of the categories that we have in our heads are not classical categories with well-defined boundaries marked by necessary and sufficient conditions. Most of the categories are indeed radial categories marked by prototypes and family resemblances. So things like furniture, or relative, or oops, wind again, or I don't know, just think of a few for yourself. It's not hard. But anyway, yeah, consciousness and life, I think, are like that. It's very hard to find a good definition for life. It's very hard to find a good definition for consciousness. There'll always be exceptions, there'll always be qualifications. Some bugger will come along with another example which requires you to change your example a bit. It's always going to be like that. So they're not classical categories, they're prototypical categories. When we think about consciousness, yeah, we've got a clear idea of it, but what we're effectively doing is we're saying, yeah, we know what consciousness is, we've got some prototypical examples of it, in our marking the central point of our category, with probably our own experience of consciousness marking the centre for ourselves. And then a series of radial a series of radial progressions outward from that towards less and less typical members. A dog, a hamster, a person in a coma, a person in a persistent vegetative state, a fetus, a 23-week-old fetus, a 20-week-old fetus, a 19-week-old fetus, an hour-old fetus. We have these radial categories going out and out and out until it gets very, very blurry indeed. And I say, same with life. In fact, as I say, there's a lot of overlap. We like to think that life is easily defined because, at least up until this point, everything that's been alive that's fulfilled that category for us has at least had the DNA thing going on for it. Although it's only the last 150 years that's been, less than that, only the last 50 years or so that we've had that. But even with that, it doesn't really make any difference. If we encountered an alien from space who talked to us and showed us their technology and their art and their science, and then we discovered that they weren't DNA based, we wouldn't suddenly say, oh, well, you're not alive then. We just change our definition of what alive is, which means, again, as I say, it's about prototypicality. The same thing as I've said about the 1-hour-old bunch of cells after conception, the 3-hour-old bunch of cells, the 23-week-old bunch of cells. At which point does that become a life? It's a radial category, and those are the ones on the borderline. And at the other end, if you're on life support and you're brain dead, are you alive? You know what I mean? It's that kind of thing. Fuzzy boundaries. Problem to that is that it's very, very hard to talk logically, rationally and coherently when the major symbols that you're working with in your language are prototypical categories, like consciousness, like life. It works really well if you're dealing with classical categories, which is why mathematics works well. Maths works well because the entities that it works with are absolutely framed in terms of classical categories, like the even number example I gave. And in fact, each number itself, each number is a category. Number 3 is a category of all those numbers that are 1 less than 4. It's a perfect category. It's only got one member in it, ideally described. You can do magic with that. And that category is equivalent to that other category, which contains all those numbers which are 1 more than 2, or an equivalent again to all those numbers to the square root of 9. Each of those have got one member equivalent to each other, so you can really do a lot of powerful things when you're dealing with classical categories that are that well defined by necessary and sufficient conditions. But life ain't like that. Life is a radial category marked by prototypes and family resemblances, and so is consciousness. So we're never going to get to the problems, I don't think. This is known. This is really well established, actually, which is why something like consciousness. I haven't been to a consciousness conference for a few years, although I've been following them, And a few years ago, because I did go to a few 15 years ago or so. And at that time, when consciousness study was just kind of breaking cover and becoming a discipline, then sure, yeah, people would start to talk about consciousness in the abstract. But really quickly, as soon as the discipline became even remotely mature, it was kind of realised this is no good. We're talking about, fuzzy categories here. We're not going to get very far. So it breaks down into different discussions and more tractable problems, to do with attention, to do with memory, to do with propositional logic, to do with neural instantiations, to do with all the different kinds of bits of it now, and the solution to what is consciousness will come out of all these different discussions, not by someone finding the magic bullet. And the same with life, really. Actually, life, this all happened to life years ago. There used to be conversations about what is life, what is the spark of life. Frankenstein is about the spark of life, isn't it? And people would suggest what that spark of life was, the élan vital, as I mentioned in my previous video. People had all kinds of ideas about what the magical stuff was that powered life. But that was just because it was an immature discipline. Biology at that time was a relatively immature discipline. As soon as it breaks down into its component parts, the problem becomes tractable. And no one says, you can solve the life problem all at once anymore. What you do is you solve each problem at a time, and you explain each part in classical terms, in terms of clear definitions with necessary and sufficient conditions marking the boundaries of those ideas. So yeah, that's that, I think. It's consciousness, hopeless term. Interesting, but hopeless. Life, interesting term, pretty hopeless. Actually, I think an interesting thing happens with these categories when you do start talking about them, which is one of the reasons why I think early sciences operate in the way they do. 2B Series could tell me about this, because she's better on this than me. No, excuse me. Which is that, when you're dealing with classical categories, the ones that are defined by necessary and sufficient conditions, when you process those enough, what starts to happen is you get abstractions. You can get abstractions out of that. So, like, the even number thing. If you did it by hand, counted up all these objects, and then all the ones that you could easily divide into two, you put in a separate category, and here is these objects. You could work through that and find out what the necessary and sufficient conditions of that category were. If you abstracted the data from the category, it would resolve back to the necessary and sufficient conditions which define that category. But you can't do that with prototypical examples forming, these radial categories. But people still try to do it. And when you do that, I think instead of an abstraction, you get a kind of essentialism going on. So, if you're talking about life, you've got all this category, there's all this life stuff in it, all these trees and plankton and people and dogs and bacteria, all this stuff. There's no clear definition. It doesn't resolve back to necessary and sufficient conditions. It kind of resolves into a kind of essentialism. So the magic of life, the spark of life, the soul, the spirit. We invent something from the ground up to populate this as a kind of material substance almost. And the same with consciousness. And that's why there's so much bogus stuff going on still about consciousness. Instead of this abstraction, because you can't make an abstraction, you can't get to the necessary and sufficient conditions. But people still like the idea of wanting to. But as I say, when you try to do that with radial categories, you get this essentialism going on. So people talk about consciousness, again, as if it was a kind of spark or a light or some magical substance. And it ain't. That's what I think, anyway. I think we need to talk about smaller terms, one at a time, break the problem down to more tractable, bite-sized portions.